So thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedules today, ladies and gentlemen, to hear my talk on the politics of climate change. The first thing I should say is I'm a social scientist, not a natural scientist, so I am not per se an expert on climate change. Our friends in the Congress would have you believe that one needs to be an expert to speak out on all public policy matters in the United States. If indeed that were the case, could any of us have viable and productive conversations about anything? And then my response to that would be, of course not. So I want to start with an assumption. And my assumption is that climate change is real and that it's anthropogenic. Okay? So I think the bottom line is, if this morning we want to question any kind of fundamental consensus on that matter, then it's difficult for me, I think for us to get anywhere. So if you'll bear with me, perhaps soon our geologist friends, aren't they the ones that make the determination, will shift us from the Holocene to the Anthropocene era, and then we can put all that, why wouldn't it be nice if we could put it all to rest that simply. Okay, so let's start with the title of my talk. And that brings up the question, what does the politics of climate change mean? Okay, so the first thing I want to do is get definitional with you this morning, ladies and gentlemen. And then really I want to talk about the process around climate change and the conversation that we're having nationally and internationally about it, and how that debate is framed by politics. And then obviously I want to have a conversation here with all of you good folks this morning and get some feedback on what I'm going to say. Okay, so first question, what does the politics in the title Politics of Climate Change mean? There are as many definitions of politics as there are political scientists, but I'm going to break out a really simple and a very famous one from a political scientist named Harold Lasswell, and some of you might be familiar with Professor Lasswell's definition of politics. It is who gets what, when, and how. So politics in that simplest of definitions is about the payoff, right, at the end of all the political debate and discourse and discussion. Who gets what, when, and how. Or as political scientists put it, perhaps a little more social scientifically, politics is about the authoritative allocation of scarce and or desirable resources. Okay? What's this got to do with climate change? Well, think. If a healthy and stable climate is simultaneously a desirable good, social good, public good, and if the healthy climate is becoming increasingly scarce due to human-fueled environmental changes, then it might be the task of political leaders to design efficacious public policies to deal with the problem of climate change. That's a simple presumption, and I think, again, it's not difficult to get consensus on that, right? We can argue over what those policies ought to be and what the cost to society might be for the implementation of them, but we could see how politics would be involved in the process of dealing with a public policy concern or issue as dire as that of climate change. So I say this in my state and local government class all the time. Government plus politics the formal powers of government plus the processes that engage us through politics equal policies, public policies, which are at some most basic or fundamental level designed to confront and deal with the problems that we face in society, including meta problems, global issues like climate change. All right. Next point. In order for politics, for leaders to determine who needs what, when, and how in order to solve the problem of climate change, those individuals, those governmental leaders, those groups, those organizations would need. Of course, you can't talk about politics very long without talking about power. Obviously, these individuals or groups or organizations would need the political power to affect these changes through public policy. However, that power is conferred upon them. In the United States, it's through democratic political processes. In China, as we just saw the last couple days, conferred through authoritarian rule. But that's not so relevant as the issue of power itself. So my next point. The politics of climate change is not simply a matter of politics. That is, of determining rationally how to authoritatively allocate resources to make decisions in order to clean up this global mess. That's a huge piece, but that would be easy, and we know how we do it today. We'd simply create some algorithm, right? And let our computers or our systems or networks spit out the solution. Rather, it's more complicated, is what I'm saying. Rather, the politics of climate change, I'm going to argue this morning, devolves itself into a conversation about power and who has it and how they choose or choose not to apply it to deal with the problem. Okay? So I'm going to argue then that the conversation about power, which must occur, does occur in the public sphere, is ultimately a question of how to use politics to resolve the issue of climate change, and that this is what I'm going to call this morning a discourse on power. Why, that's so Foucauldian. And if some of you are familiar here with Michel Foucault's theory of his discourse on power, certainly I'd commend you to that French, now deceased French philosopher. Okay, so I'm really definitional, and social scientists are this way. We don't like to proceed without concrete definitions of the concepts that we're unspooling when we make an argument like this. So the next question would be, Baczynski, now you need to give us a definition of power as well as a clearer sense of what I mean by a discourse on power and the impact that that has on the political process and the subsequent impact it might have on climate change and how we move forward as a people, a nation, indeed a global civilization to resolve these issues. Okay, so here's the power definition now. Again, there's as many definitions of it as there are, and now it's not just political scientists, but social scientists in general, philosophers, sociologists, so on. But here's the working definition of power that I want to use this morning. Power is, by the way, this comes from Dr. Robert Dahl, extraordinary man of Yale political science department, now deceased just a few years back. But Dr. Dahl said, A has power over for B to the extent that he, it's an older definition, can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do. Robert Dahl, power. Okay? So the definition of power I presented to you all this morning clearly has what kind of an aspect? Authoritative, or very good, very good. Or some other language I thought that the definition is of power has a degree of compellence. And I think we all intuitively understand that dimension. You are in my power. I can compel you. I can somehow control you or persuade you rationally or otherwise to do things that you would not otherwise do or recognize were in your self-interest or collective interest to do, absent the compelling nature of power in Dr. Dahl's definition. Okay, so now I can tie all this together. What does it mean then to say that the politics of climate change is ultimately a discourse on power? It means that in our desire to understand and act in a timely manner on climate change, that whoever controls the narrative, whoever commands the heights of the discourse on power, whoever most effectively shapes the story of climate change and molds it through discourse in the public sphere, will ultimately determine when and how we act as a species or do not act as a species on those aspects of climate change that confront us today. In other words, the discourse on power will determine fundamentally, with regard to the issue of climate change, who gets what, when, and how. So maybe some of you were disappointed this morning because you thought, well, politics of climate change, all right, he's a political scientist, so he's going to talk about ways in which political leaders in Washington, the 50 states, European Union, China, India, big polluters today, as emergent and rapidly industrializing nations, can implement public policies in order to slow climate change or potentially even reverse the most deleterious aspects of it. Well, I ain't going to do that at all. All right? I don't want to talk about specific policies which would require local, national, or global implementation to deal with the crisis of climate change. Rather, you can see what I'm doing today is speaking to the process of how this change comes about. So I'll reference another political scientist who I did not study with, but who I studied with the students of, and he was an extraordinary person. Some in the room may even know the political philosopher, we call him, Leo Strauss. And Strauss said about the process of politics that all politics, in its broadest sense, aims at change or preservation of the status quo. And to a large extent, that's what the discourse on power, the narrative, the debate over climate change is about today, right? Do we stand pat or do we do something? If we do something, how much and how quickly are we prepared to move forward? Or if we stand pat, then we have to be willing to bear the economic, social, and ultimately human costs of preserving the status quo, politically speaking, with regard to climate change and the implications of standing pat as parts per million in the Earth's atmosphere continues to increase from one year to the next. All right, so last thing I've got to do then this morning before we open it up is talk about the narrative or the frame in which our conversation about climate change in the United States has been taking place about since the last generation or so. In short, to be clear, controlling the narrative means, you mentioned this at the outset, that even the facts of the issue of climate change are somehow subsidiary to or subordinated to how one frames the public discourse about it and presents it in the public sphere. And natural scientists, sorry Joe, sorry Walt, have taken a hit about this. You guys have all the facts straight from a scientific point of view, but that's not what's important in the debate and the resolution of the issue of climate change today. What's important is the narrative, that is, how we frame and present those facts to the public. And here we'll differentiate between scientific facts and social facts. I'd like to read The Guardian online, and I recommend Guardian.com to all of you for what I believe is its often excellent reporting. This comes from Guardian.com, and this piece said climate change is a scientific fact, and it's something that we live with every day. Violent hurricanes this summer and fall from warming oceans in part, increased incidence of massive wildfires out of control in central and northern California. Just recently, I know it's weather more than climate, but you start to add it up after a year of data. But here's another week to 10 days of 70 to 80 degree temperatures in the Northeast. Even the poor World Series. Isn't this the first time that it's began in late October with 100 degree plus temperatures for the fall? Forget the Fall Classic. We'll rename it It feels like the middle of July in the Sahara Desert Classic. You feel sorry for the players that have to. So there's climate change as a scientific fact, and we experience it daily. But the argument that Emil Durkheim and others would make, is sociologists this time, is that climate change has not yet embedded itself consciously as a social fact, right? A social fact is, as Durkheim says, acting, thinking, and feeling external to the individual, invested with, back to our definition, a coercive power over them. So a social fact in my discipline of political science would be the rule of law. The notion that morally there should be equal justice under law, or that no one is above the law, and that we feel this social fact and we operate as individuals, and our institutions operate with something like the rule of law as a social fact. But we don't do that yet with climate change. So what about the frame then, in what I'm calling this power discourse, which is, in the broadest sense, is behind the kind of wizard behind the scenes of the politics of climate change? Well, we know what the frame is largely on the right. It's that climate change is not real, and that the economic costs of dealing with a non-problem are too severe to the American and global economy and too risky for global financial markets. And besides, scientists, 97% is not enough. Scientists still haven't reached a definitive consensus. And after all, the situation with climate change is one that we can push down the road. It's a problem that we don't necessarily need to or want to deal with now. The right frame on the issue says, and we'll leave that business of confronting it to future generations. And that discourse of power, right, that frame, whether through the media or government leaders, has been very successful in the United States over the last 15 or 20 years. And so I think that has implications for public policy. In spite of incipient measures, there's been little that's been accomplished systematically nationally in our efforts to address climate change. I found a few examples of how this frame has worked fairly effectively, this discourse. As late as 2008, the United States Congress was still forming subcommittees to examine the issue. Okay? A carbon tax, we've heard about that in some of these discussions. And I know Congressman Maloney was here a couple weeks ago talking about it, but it's a non-starter in the United States Congress. With the exception of a handful of countries globally, the idea of pricing CO2 emissions seems extremely problematic. All right, what about a frame on the left? What does that look like? Well, you go to the internet as well as I can and visit things like Environmental Magazine, which I think had a nice example of a left-wing frame, or power discourse, and how that could be presented and spooled out, as I've been saying. So you could frame climate change as an issue of social progress, that it improves the quality of life to deal with climate issues, both between human species and other species on the planet. It allows us this notion of a frame of social progress, dealing with climate issues, to live more in harmony with nature. Think of Diane Bliss's lecture last week, than trying to constantly master nature through extraction of fossil fuels or whatever. So one frame is anything we do on climate change has to be more socially progressive in Leo Strauss's definition than standing pat or simply preserving the status quo. Another frame on the left we've seen recently, kind of in a more compromised vein, is the frame discourse of economic development. That everybody benefits from addressing issues of climate change. Greener technologies, development in industries like solar and wind. Or you can frame the issue from the Pandora's box perspective. That's the worst case scenario. Parts per million reaches critical mass, and then boom, game over. We didn't act soon enough. We stood pat, we preserved the status quo. The narrative or the frame on the right was more effective in this discourse on power, and how that discourse plays out in our ability to act or not act. And if we don't do it now, we can't push the problem down the road. It'll simply be, it'll be too late. So to me, the social progress frame is the most optimistic. Kind of the economic development one is the cautiously optimistic one that splits the difference. Yeah, we'll continue to frack, but in the meantime, we can make sure that solar and wind are technologies that are properly developed and implemented to reduce fossil fuel emissions significantly. And the Pandora's box is, holy crap, it's now or never. Our planet can't wait. And I thought, since I'm talking really about language here and how we deploy language in a political sense to kind of reach this critical mass which can precipitate change on the issue of climate change, it happens all the time. Rachel Carson did it. And, folks are nodding in the audience now because you remember her now classic environmental work from 1962, Silent Spring. That book reframed the debate or the discourse on power with regard to pesticides, in particular to DDT, which within a decade some of those most harmful pesticides were subsequently banned, taken out of production, and we saw rising populations of bald eagles and many other species. Nature writers that I'm very familiar with, Barry Lopez, Ed Abbey, and others have reached a large audience and have shifted the public discourse, the discourse on power or the debate over ecological and environmental issues mightily in the last 40 or 50 years. So that's kind of the hopeful part, that if you want to reframe the debate in such a way that the social facts will embed themselves in our collective consciousness and allow us to act on climate change politically, socially, ethically, morally before the proverbial poop really hits the fan, then there's hope. On the other hand, maybe not. So, you think of the internet, and the internet is just, it's a gigantic megaphone when it comes to issues like climate change. So it's like whoever shouts the loudest gets heard the most, whether they got the facts, the scientific facts correct or not. The internet also fragments communities. When Rachel Carson published that book in the early 1960s, you could reach a diverse and somewhat more homogeneous environmental or ecological community, and you can't today, because there are all these fragmented communities out there on the internet in the United States and largely around the world who suffer from message fatigue anyway. So even if we take the most extreme approach, which is the sky is falling, we need to frame the debate on the left in terms of do something now, because it will be too late even in 5 or 10 years, and we can't set standards for automobile emissions or greenhouse gas emissions from smokestacks and allow continued use of coal-fired power plants in the United States and Europe, let alone in China and India. It's all got to stop. Yeah, I guess. But then message fatigue sets in, and fragmented communities make potentially problematic precisely what I'm theorizing about, because if you're going to talk about power and how to deploy it for social and public good, you presumably have to reach the broadest audience possible in the shortest period of time to deal with the crisis before it maybe is too late. And then, of course, you always deal with organized power. The fossil fuel industry can speak very loud and very plainly on their point of view, and certainly continue to do so. I want to stop. I want to stop there. So let me just summarize. So Dr. Jan asked me to talk about politics of climate change. So in order to talk about the politics of climate change from a political scientist perspective, you have to talk about allocation of resources, who gets what, when, and how. That led us into that definition, and the understanding that a clean environment, a safe environment, is presumably the most desirable of resources because it's foundational for everything else that we do as Homo sapiens. That led us to a question about the conversation with regard to climate change, or what I call the discourse on power, and the compelling nature of political speech in the public sphere. And that led us to talk a little bit about how the debate over climate change has been framed on the right and the left today, and the implications that has for our ability to act or to not act from a public policy standpoint on the issue of climate change.